Some people walk into a room and you can really feel the immediate shift in the atmosphere, not with volume, but presence. Andrea Leeb is one of those people. Her story is woven with moments that could have absolutely broken her. Yet she chose to rise with a kind of grounded courage that feels both fierce and deeply tender. Andrea has learned to meet life's hardest chapters with so much honesty, humor, and a wisdom that comes only from doing the work. As she says so powerfully, strength is in what you show the world. It's what you survive in the dark. In our conversation, you're going to hear how she turned pain into perspective, how she reclaimed her voice after seasons that tried to silence it, and how she now uses her story to help others find their footing again. Andrea embodies resilience in my mind, in motion, real, raw, and beautifully human. So I want you to settle in, and I want you to let her journey remind you, even in the messiest places in this world, hope has a way of wiggling its way through. So sit back, and I hope you enjoy Andrea as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Broken Beautiful Me, stories of hope, gratitude, and resilience. And I am so fortunate today to have as our guest, Andrea Leeb, is a writer and survivor advocate living in Venice Beach, California. Her work has been published in numerous literary journals, including Litro Magazine, the Potomac Review, Text Power, Telling Magazine, and HerStry. In 2025, she was a nonfiction finalist in the Tucson Festival of Books Literary Awards program. She has an MFA from the Bennington Writing Seminars, a JD from the Cardozo School of Law, and a BSN from Georgetown University. Previously, Andrea worked as both an attorney and as a registered nurse. Currently, she is a member of the Advisory Board of Directors for the UCLA Rape Treatment Center and dedicates her time to advocating for survivors of sexual assault and writing Such a Pretty Picture. A Memoir is Andrea's first full-length book. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want, if we could start off by giving our listeners an idea of your story and how it culminated into your book.
Okay, great. So for your listeners, my story is about surviving childhood sexual abuse, specifically incest, that was perpetrated by my father. And the story starts with, I was 4.5 years old when it started, and my mother actually caught him, walked into the bathroom where he was giving me a bath. It was the first time I remember my father ever giving me a bath. And she walked into the bathroom, screamed, fell to the floor, and when she woke, she was blind. So as a child, I incorporated, I thought this was my fault. My father told me it was my fault, and I absolutely believed it for a long time. And my mother stayed only physically blind for a month, but she metaphorically blind for decades. So the story is about what happened, the impact of it on me as a child and a young adult, and also about my recovery and the fact that I did heal. And, the message is if I healed, everyone can heal. The abuse went on until I was 13, so it was a very long time. I have written my whole life on and off. And, I wrote as a child, I have a diary, but I didn't write about me. I wrote about a girl named Emily because I thought her life would be better than mine, which it was. And I have written stories for a long time. And when I got my MFA, I worked mostly on short stories and always on fiction. And I never intended to tell that. I had talked, of course, about this story, which we'll get into, with therapists and with my close friends. My husband knew before we got married about it, but I had never intended to go public with it on a really public level. And in 2017, we had, as we all recall, the Me Too movement. And I started reading the stories about that one survivor was writing and how it impacted another survivor. And they would all say, oh my God, this happened to me too. And they'd write their story. And I thought, I have a story that I have to tell. And maybe, just maybe, if I start telling it, I can help others. So that was the beginning. It happened that my father also died at that time, which made it a little bit easier to go more public. But for me, and that's a whole complicated thing we can talk about as we continue our conversation, my relationship with my parents post-recovery. But anyway, I started writing right around that time. And as I started writing, another gift came to me. And I realized, I can do more than just write a story. I can go out. I have, had a lot of public speaking experience as an attorney, and I can go out and become an advocate and speak about childhood sexual abuse, do more for the community. So that kind of started coming. It was a gift of writing the book. And in that time period, I ultimately was joined the UCLA Rape Treatment Center Advisory Board. I've been involved with other organizations, and I have had the opportunity to moderate panels and be involved in speaking more publicly about this issue. So the book became a great thing for me because I got to do something artistically, and as well as it created an ability to become an advocate. I call this all my third act. So,
which I love. And I love that you reference the Me Too movement and how people started to share their stories and give others the courage and strength to do so. It was a remarkable time, like a window of time where there was this huge shift. And I remember thinking back to instances in my own life where, okay, yeah, me too. I've experienced something, and it was an uncomfortable time, I think, but it was so healing that so many people stepped forward and said, okay, enough. How did it feel for you to get the first copy of that book and to look at it and see your courageous story of surviving and thriving?
It's a process. You get, as a writer, you get what they call an advanced reader copy first, where you go through it and make sure that the book is close to perfect, as anything can be, because nothing is, with respect to typos or things like that, editorial issues, formatting. But it was exciting. I mean, I have a little tiny clip on my Instagram of opening the box, and I actually cried. I cried when I got it, because this was not an easy book to write. And as I said, I never, ever intended to write this book. I intended to write a novel. I have 3/4 of a novel written. I intended to write short stories, which I did and published, but never intended this. So it had been, there were so many things that went into doing it, and excavating these memories was difficult, obviously. And so I cried. And I cried a lot along the way, but now it's happy tears, because every time I go to a bookstore, every single time, or I am out in public about the book, someone comes up to me and tells me, you just wrote my story, and I've been afraid to tell it. Thank you. I've gotten emails from people who have told me that, this is their story. I volunteer at something called Stuart House, which is part of UCLA Rape Treatment Center. And it's basically this model where the children come in and they don't have to go to 1,000 different places to, the police are there, the therapists are there, and they have like amazing forensic therapists on call, there just for the children to tell their stories. And my volunteer job, I'm the play lady, because it's a long day for these, it's ages whatever to 18. But for the young kids especially, it's a really long day, and the parents often go in for their own if the parents are non-perpetrators, stories, therapy. So I play with the children in that time period. I'm a play lady. It's a really great job. And the best job I've ever had. I know a lot about Uno and Bluey's house now. And so all kinds of little games. But I realize when I see those parents walking in, it's so common. I mean, this is not, child sexual abuse is 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. And it's also 90% of it, unfortunately, is people they know. So it's so common. So seeing this and being involved in that community, the book, I would have never done that without writing the book. So we have I cry a lot. I cry with gratitude.
Yeah. It's opened up so many other avenues where you can support people. How was it for you with your family writing a book like this?
So, my sister, who I dedicate the book to, was and is always my best friend. I was lucky. I know that with this kind of thing, she was not abused in that way. My father was a very abusive person. So, the sexual abuse was one part of a component, unfortunately. She had he was very violent and mean to us generally. And she went through a lot with that, but she wasn't sexually abused. So often what I've read is when one child is, and I'm using air quotes, which I don't usually do, but chosen, then the other child, there's often issues with both ends. One kid gets angry, like, why wasn't I picked, believe it or not, because they start thinking they're little kids. They're the favorite, and they notice, even if they don't know what's going on, they notice a specific relationship. Sharing a secret creates a specific relationship. Or the child who's been abused gets angry at the unabused child. Why were they protected? Luckily, and I'm not saying that those feelings may not have occurred on some level, but my sister and I, we were like 2 little survivors in a boat and on a life raft. And we held on to each other closely through childhood and through life. And she's my best friend still, was and is my best friend. So that she was really in support of the book, although she told me that it opened a lot of memories for her that she's had to. She I don't think she would mind me saying she actually went back into therapy herself after reading the book because she felt like she needed to kind of deal with some things on a deeper level. My mother was still alive, and she did not know she knew I was writing something, but she didn't know what, and I had a relationship. I kept my relationship with my parents, partially because I loved my mother. I loved her unconditionally. I know she didn't protect me, but I kept my relationship with her. My father, I would not have, except for my mother would not leave him. And so it was a 2-for-1 deal. But my mother was still alive, but we wouldn't talk about it. Every once in a while she'd say, I know you're writing a book about your father, and I don't agree. But there was resolution eventually. She died before the book came out, and I don't think I could have published it while she was still alive, to be perfectly honest. It would have been really hard to be out here this publicly. There was a big Daily Mail article about me and my mom, and there were some pictures of us when I was little, and it got like 2 million views. It went kind of viral, but there were a lot of comments, and those would have been harder for me to handle if my mom was still alive. So in some ways, I was grateful that it came out after she had passed. I'd had trouble getting it published because it's not, people were like, the writing is great, but I think my writing is pretty good, actually. As good as any writer thinks their writing is. We all criticize ourselves constantly. But I got a lot of really nice compliments about the book, but people told me that I wasn't famous enough and my father wasn't famous enough to merit this book. Now, whether that's true or not, I have to take that on face value. But I got the note from my press that ended up publishing it that they were taking the book on the 1 year anniversary of my mother's death. And I had this really, I'm not that woo, but I had this moment where, I actually said to my mother, who's in the wherever she is, heaven, let's say, I had said to her, I know this is something you would not have agreed with me doing. We're private, we're a secret holding family, but give me a message. Give me a really strong message that I absolutely should not go forward, or give me a message that it's okay. And I thought, I'm going to take this as her message to me that it came that day.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you have to be woo-woo to see the connection there.
Yeah, so it really, I had told my publisher that I said, I want you to know this is what happened. And she was really like, I was in a conversation with her at a bookstore, and she was really taken aback by that. How serendipitous is that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You've spoken about the masks we wear. What was the moment you realized you were hiding from yourself on this journey?
So as a young woman, this all went on until I was 13, and then it stopped. And as I got older, I really believed. I mean, I grew up with a mother who actually went blind to not see the truth, and I really believed for a long time if I could be smart enough, pretty enough, educated enough, basically perfect enough, I could pretend the abuse away. I don't think it's unique to me. I think a lot of people, I didn't have, fortunately and unfortunately, a lot of people really tap that down consciously. I did not do that. I always knew what had happened. I couldn't forget. I just couldn't. I tried so hard to forget, but I couldn't. But I really believe that at least if I pretended enough, I could put this mask on of being and help my family, to third parties look like, oh yeah, I come from the perfect family. I had people who knew me when I was 13 or 14 who wrote a note and said, I didn't know that was going on. And I was like, how could you? Because I was like, I'm so sorry I didn't do anything. I was like, well, first off, you were 14 too. And secondly, how would you know if I didn't tell you? I mean, I have an ex-husband who wrote me a note. And he said he was so sweet. He sobbed when he read the book, absolutely sobbed. And he said, I'm so proud of you. He said, I knew there was something, but I never knew what it was or how bad.
Mm. And I think we all, at certain points, and we sometimes exchange one mask for the other as we enter into a new stage of our life, until it bubbles up and we want to look at it and see what we can learn.
And sometimes it's not because we want to look at it. Like in my book, and I wrote, this is on the back of the book, so it's not a big spoiler alert, but I was 33 and somebody grabbed my breast on New York City subway. For those of us who grew up who came of age in the 80s and 90s, this was probably not that uncommon. A lot of women I know had been, and for any women, even grabbed and touched, but I had a complete nervous breakdown about it, and about that, and that finally, I realized I was really I was starting to have a lot of suicidal ideation, and I realized and panic attacks, and if I didn't get some help for this, if I didn't come talk about it and begin to get some help for this, I was really afraid I would kill myself. So it was not a matter of want, it was a matter of need, and what I did want to do was keep living.
So how would you define resilience when you look at your journey and you look at the people around you in this world? What would be your definition of resilience, and how has that definition shifted over time?
Well, my earlier definition of resilience was I really believed if I could be perfect enough, tough enough, and get enough A's, keep going, look at me, all this stuff did happen, but I don't have to think about it every day. I don't have to be a victim. I can just move on and be tough and not be as feeling as I would want. Intimacy could only go so far when you've got that kind of attitude. Love is something that becomes superficial. But eventually, with help and how I feel today, I talk about this a lot. I embrace my trauma. What happened, happened. I can't, as Maya Angelou talks about, I can't bounce back and change the past, right? I would prefer that it didn't happen. If you gave me, somebody said to me, I got a really good review from a reviewer and a friend of mine who writes that it wasn't worth the trauma, and I laughed. He was kidding, and I laughed. But I would have rather had another book to write and not this one. But I realized that I still have to embrace it. I have to admit that it happened. I have to embrace it, and it's kind of like bouncing forward. I have to take that and become the person that I am today. How can I repurpose my trauma into something good? Everyone doesn't have to become an advocate or Mother Teresa, but it's for yourself, something good, to live a better life, And so for me, that's resilience today, is the ability to accept what happened, move forward, and keep going with the acknowledgement that sometimes we're human and we're going to feel, and we're going to have to sit with them feeling sad, and to ask for. I mentor a lot of young women, and I say, there are two words. One is not the best word anymore. I'm fine, F-I-N-E, a four-letter word. When you're not fine is not a good thing. I need help. Also a four-letter word is is the word we have to look at. And being able to ask for help is resilience.
I mean, that's such a courageous act when we finally can admit that we need the help of others. You say that authenticity is resistance, and I absolutely love this. Can you share a time when living authentically felt like an act of rebellion?
Well, I actually think it's first off, writing this book was really authentic. I mean, that goes without saying. That's the easiest example. But I think even, when, or an act of resistance was, of resilience was, when I met my husband, I had to say, this is what happened. And this is by the way, my parents are in my life. So this is my decision, but I have to be honest and authentic. I'm a person, I can't walk away from my mother. A lot of people I've been told that was, by lots of people, that maybe it wasn't the best thing, but yet it was authentic to me. And so I think that was an act of, but I had to tell him. I realized when we met, I couldn't let the relationship go beyond a few months without, it wasn't a first date conversation. For survivors out there, you don't need to make this a first date conversation. But I did have to tell him before it went further. So I think it's and now when I get up and I speak so publicly everywhere, to 100 people, to at bookstores, every time I tell my story, it's an act of both rebellion and also resilience. For me, it's interesting, the word victim. First off, I write in my book that I hated the word survivor even, because I didn't want to pretend. I wanted to pretend I didn't have anything to survive. When you come from a perfect family, why do you have to survive anything? But the word victim was a word that I couldn't embrace for a really long time, until very recently. And when I started doing work with UCLA Rape Treatment Center, they used the word victim. And I was like, why do you use the word victim? We don't want to be victimized or walk around feeling, we want to move forward, bounce forward. And we survivors are victims. A crime was perpetrated against us. It was not our fault. So we are victims of a crime. You wouldn't tell somebody who was a victim of a robbery to not use the word victim. They get to use the word victim. And I suddenly realized, yeah, I was a victim. I have, something was, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to live my life as a person who's constantly victimized, but I have to, say that proudly in some ways. I was a victim of a crime. So that too is both an act of resilience and an act of resistance. To admit that a crime was perpetrated and to admit publicly it's not my fault. It was never my fault. And even with my mom, who I really protected, and for a long time, it took, being a 4.5-year-old and being in this strange thing with your father that you don't really know what's going on, but it feels weird, and he's touching you, and he's breathing heavy, and then your mother walks in and goes blind. You go, oh my God, what did I do? And it took a long time to be able to, that little kernel of guilt stayed with me for a really long time, even after years of therapy. But being able to say, you know what, none of this was my fault, and it's not my job to protect you. Mm-hmm. Even if, it was never my job to protect her.
Were you ever able to talk with your mom about that moment?
So I tried, but she was not having it. And my mother was a person who didn't like to look at anything that wasn't pretty. She had a pair of, I confronted my parents when I was in my 30s, 33, when I ended up in inpatient. And before I went into inpatient, and she actually made up, she was mad and angry, it was on the phone, and she hung up on me, and then she got on the phone with my father, and they were denying it, but then suddenly she realized, she came up with this story that this other person did it, that I was touched at some point. We didn't talk about the bathtub. She refused to admit that. She always said she was bathing me, my father was bathing me in cold water, and she freaked out. She saw the cold water and freaked out. But there were the airports again. And but my mother made up on the spot. She goes, oh my God, it must have been, and I believe I called the person Dick Green. That wasn't really his name, or Don Green. And she goes, it must have been Don Green. He did it, and he wore the same glasses as Daddy. He's the same height. You must have gotten confused by, your memory must be confused, but it was really Don Green. And she kept that Don Green story for decades. I mean, this was like, okay, yes, you were abused as a child. You have to get over it. And it was Don Green, not your father.
Wow.
So she couldn't look at anything in a way, my mom could not handle the feelings of being uncomfortable. She had to make up a pretty story. So in the very end of her life, in the epilogue of my book, in the end of her life, my mother finally apologized for the first time. And it was 2 weeks before she died.
Oh my goodness.
So, but, it gave me an ability. I appreciate that she did. And I actually almost I wanted to stop her. That was hard. Because I was like, oh no, you're so sick. We don't have to go there now. And I didn't. I shut up for once and let her apologize to me. And it was, it definitely, it gave me the ability, first off, to forgive myself for any little kernel of guilt, but also to forgive her. Because if she hadn't, I would have never completely, I kept her in my life. I loved her unconditionally, but I never completely forgave her. I was willing to stay with her because I didn't want to keep her in my life and not, but I never really forgave her till that moment. I tried, but I couldn't, because who doesn't protect their child? That said, and I will say this, not to be defensive of my mother, but to realize where women were. I'm 67 years old, and so this all happened in 1962 to the 70s. And we as women really had no power. We have power now. And, I will say we need to keep our power. We need to do what we can in these days, particularly, to keep our power. We have to remember in 1970, my mother in 1962 was also quite young. She couldn't get a credit card. I mean, she couldn't get a credit card until 1972. So that's where women were back then. So leaving your husband, no matter how abusive he was, while you should, and she should have, was not quite as simple as it might be today. That said, it's still hard. I mean, the women who bring their children in, if it's the stepfather, the boyfriend, the father, I'm like at the Stuart house. Every time I see them, I think you are my hero. You are. I know who my hero is. My hero is every one of you. Mm-hmm. And they don't ask me, and I don't talk about that, but I think it.
That's so true, and I'm so happy that you were able to have that moment with your mom at the end of her life. You are so right about generationally. It was just a different time, and that's not saying anything was okay, but it is recognizing that women did not have the ability to affect change in certain areas of their life, like you say with the credit card. I think if I was to tell my 28-year-old son that women couldn't get credit cards until 1976, she said, he would be.
I think it was 72, sometime around there. I'm pretty sure.
But I mean, they would be floored. But there was definite boundaries that women had an inability to and I saw that in my own mother's life.
Well, and in our lives too. Think about the Me Too movement. Getting back to that, it came, and we didn't tell. We were afraid to tell. I mean, we were shrugging off a grab on the subway. Honestly, we were shrugging off a grab at work, or and the women of my generation for sure. It came to be. I read a book of someone who asked me to blurb their book, and I, without getting into that book too much, she was a stockbroker in it's called House of Pretend. It'll be out in April. I like it a lot, and so I'll give her a little plug. But she was a stockbroker and working on Wall Street in the 1980s. People said absurd things to her. It makes me a little scared, because I get scared that I don't want women to go back to the days where it's okay to be verbally abused or sexualized without without speaking up.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, realistically, what does that look like in today's world? Like, how do we support each other?
With respect to survivors, I think we have to believe first. We have to believe. I'm not saying that, I know there have been cases where people have made allegations that were false, but more often than not, they don't. And I think survivors need to be believed. I think, obviously, I'm a lawyer, and I believe in evidence, and I believe in people looking at, but survivors have to be believed. It's so hard to admit that things like this happen to you, to yourself, or to a third party. So that's the first place. And I think as women, we need to support each other. I don't know. You might not like this, but I think we need to vote.
We're allowed to talk about whatever we want.
Okay. So, because we want to be careful that we don't move backwards. And so I think it's really important. It's so hard, it's so hard sometimes. Women are not, and even today, I think that we have done a better job with our nieces and our daughters of telling them that their voices are meant to be heard. But we're on some level, pretty little girls are supposed to be pretty and say nothing. And I think we internalize that a lot. And I think we have to learn not to internalize this. I encourage everyone to read Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale if you haven't read it. There you have it.
Absolutely. I agree. Everyone needs to read that book. A little close to home these days.
That's how we support women right now. Just start with that book and think about it.
But I mean, I think in times like this, when it feels like things are being clawed back, it's about grounding ourselves, connecting with each other, recognizing and celebrating each other's power, educating people on what their rights are.
Correct.
I think it's important that we continue to encourage young girls in STEM. And, there's so many things that are beyond our control that we face in life.
I agree. And I also think it's good to, I had trouble with any kind of intimacy, to be honest, growing up. I mean, intimacy with men in romantic relationships, intimacy with women friends. I kept people a little bit away. I would only show them the mask because I was afraid of if I dropped it, I would crumble. But I really think it's important for us to have other women support groups, women that we talk to, friends. I think that, I really think it's important to empower. I mentor a lot of young women. I'm involved in this organization, and we mentor young women from post-conflict countries right now. It's a little strange these days, but, they're from Cambodia, Liberia, Guatemala, and they come here to college with the idea of building female leadership in their countries. And I think we have to look at now, what can we do to continue to build female leadership in the world? I mean, that's the idea, is worldwide, kind of giving women power across the world in countries where they haven't historically had power, and keeping whatever power we've gained here.
Right.
Which, doesn't mean we have to dictate the world, but it does mean we have to be aware enough.
Well, and we have to, if we want to have a balanced and fair community, leadership needs to be balanced. So we need to have both the masculine and the feminine involved in decisions.
And we need to listen to men too. I'm married to a man. I like him very much. He's very smart. We need to listen to them as well. But I do think that we should be, looking at other women and having support helps, especially for the women who are survivors. Although, like I said, this issue, my issue that I go out on, is not just women. I am surprised because when I'm at bookstores, I have had men come up to me. And that always surprises me. But now that I'm at Stuart House volunteering, especially for the young kids, it's really, I've noticed, this is just anecdotal, it's not any statistic, but what I've noticed is that the older children who come in are usually girls, the preteens and teens, but the little ones are often boys. And, so the 1 in 6 is actually true, and that's just reported. There are boys who also are sexually assaulted. So, we need to be aware of that. But this is not, that particular thing. It's not just more often females, but not only females.
Mm-hmm. I grew up in Canada, in Newfoundland, and it was late 70s, early 80s. There was a place, Mount Cashel, which was a home for the boys. And there was a huge scandal that broke with abuse. And it was such a tragedy for the whole province. And years later, these brave men came forward and they still walk with it. And I just have so much respect for the strength that must have taken them to come forward. It just floors me. In some ways, I think it's harder for men, but to come forward, but it's hard for anyone. I admire every survivor that comes forward.
And, people who can come, who have the ability, I don't think you should come. One thing, you don't need to come publicly forward if at harm to yourself. But if you feel that you have the strength to, then it gives people, it's a just personal decision, just like seeking justice is a personal, justice, what is justice, or, reporting to the police. These are all personal decisions. But I admire anyone who asks for help first and foremost. But for these men who walk forward, again, it's really, it must take a lot for them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you make a great point there, is that the healing path for people is different. Some people will want to absolutely write a book about it, talk about it, take a more public path. But that doesn't mean that the person who decides to talk about it in a safe group with a good facilitator and keep it within that circle and heal privately the way that they want, like there's no wrong way to do that, is there?
There is no wrong way, and I think we all have to, and we can't judge others. People have asked me about, did I report my father? And I was also, assaulted in middle when I was 14. Did I report the 3 boys who assaulted me? And I didn't. I couldn't have at 14. It would, but also reporting my parents, there wasn't really the same outlet for that, doing that. And even after, I just couldn't. And that was my decision. I thought about it a lot. I worry a little bit about my father. And, was he perpetrating crimes against other children? I try to tell myself no. And I think it was, but you never know. This is it's a crime of recidivism, but it is also a crime of opportunity. And thank God he wasn't around many children other than my sister and me. In fact, he kept himself away from children, interestingly enough. But he was a professor, and he taught in colleges. So, there were young women at his disposal. I'm not sure what happened there. And I do think about that, but it was, at the time, my decision. I think about whether I would have made a different decision if I came of age today. I don't know the answer, honestly. I've really given this a lot of reflection. But what I do know is everyone has to come, as we were talking about, to their own, where the most important thing in this is, again, it wasn't your fault, you were a victim, and you need to heal. That's what my message is, for survivors. The first thing that has to be is healing. And how do you do that? As you said, a safe facilitated group, a life coach. For me, it was therapy. Therapy was what I really needed, and I'm a big believer in it because of how it helped me, but it's not the only avenue. But you need to find that path and tell, because what you can't do, and I think this is universal, is keep the secret inside of yourself, because it will eat you up alive.
And it will continue to bubble up in your life in different ways.
There's it will affect your relationships. It did mine. It will. You can't pretend this away. Trust me, if you could, I would have done it. I'm a master mask maker. I was tutored as an early age by a true master in pretend, and I could not pretend it away.
Yeah. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of healing? And I apologize that my Labrador Sam keeps chiming in on our chat.
I like a dog in every environment. Mine just recently passed. So.
He just has a lot to say.
Yeah, I love a dog. Everyone should. But I always have a lot to say. They're big healing. Dogs are really good for healing. No, I think the most misunderstood thing is the idea that it would be linear. This is really people. And again, it's kind of like, oh, don't we wish it were? Don't we wish we could walk out when, I perfect sunny day and go, I'm healed. But I think it does happen. And I think we have to give ourselves, it's not linear. And there's moments where this past, this thing, this abuse, the impact of it may crop up in our behaviors, in how we're feeling, in triggers, what hurts us. I mean, I know I have, been in enough, I have what they call complex PTSD because because the abuse continued for so long, it was so continual. But these kinds of PTSD things happen. I think it's okay. We just recognize it. We recognize it. And what we can't let it do is, when we're truly healing, is to continue to move on and move forward and give ourselves the grace. As people who are healing, and I consider this lifelong healing because it was a lot of abuse, but I always give myself a little bit of grace. We can't be perfect, and if something startles us in a way that we feel like, oh my God, this is like so abnormal, no one gets startled, it's like grace. Like, okay, well, I don't know this person, the rest of the world's experience. I know mine. And it doesn't even have to be, it's any kind of healing. Grief healing. We have to give ourselves grace to have a moment to go, okay, I'm going to step back and hey, maybe I need to talk to somebody again. Maybe I just need to sit with it. We all know, but being aware enough to realize that.
Mm-hmm. I work a lot with the bereaved, and I often describe grief as a tangled set of Christmas lights. It's
a great way.
Like that is, we pulled it out of the box. We probably haven't plugged it in since the 70s. What's happening with this set of lights? And that's how it felt for me, because where's the bulb that's out? I have to figure that out first. It just was like, it was so twisty, turny, and based on the relationship that you have with that person. And grace is something that it was a lesson that was hard learned for me. I guess I felt like I didn't deserve it.
Yeah, we all. I think that's the thing. We don't feel like we don't deserve it. And on grief, one of the things that I've been exploring lately on the page, although I haven't published anything, but I've been kind of writing a bit about it personally, is the idea that grief is something that I too. I grieved for my mother, but I also have grieved, and in writing the book, and one of the things, I grieved from my childhood. Because I realized when I wrote the book that I never really was a child, and I never really got to have those moments of joy in childhood, and it made me really sad. It was a type, I hadn't really ever looked at that as much, and now it's something that I've kind of been exploring. Like, I miss that. I miss those moments of playing. I never played. I was in another podcast, and I wrote something, and they said, oh, I didn't even remember it. And I laughed. I said, I had a teacher in my MFA program who said, when you sit down to write, let your fingers play. And then she then said to me, did you ever, play like you were a child? And, it hits me. I wasn't. And I think I grieve that. That was like the Christmas lights being plugged in, and I realized some were missing. They were like missing, or they were like keep short circuiting. So it's a great analogy. And grief is, you can in all kinds of packages.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons that I started this podcast, is to talk about all of those different packages. It's not necessarily just the loss of a loved one. It's, I remember having a conversation with a guy, and he asked me about my work, and I told him that I started doing it when I lost my son. And he paused for a moment, and he was doing a photography session with me, and I could sense his discomfort. And I absolutely hate to make people uncomfortable like that, but he asked the direct question, and he said, yeah, I just lost my dog. And I took a deep breath in, and because initially I think your first reaction is, okay, wait a second. And then I said, tell me about your dog. And you know what? His dog was his child.
Yeah.
He loved his dog so much. And if I hadn't extended an open hand to him and say, keep talking, to give him some grace and let him continue on, we never would have connected. And I think that sometimes that's what we do as humans. Well, I'm over here in this box, and this box is way up here, and your box of pain is down here on this shelf. So I'm up here. And we just stay disconnected from each other.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that's really, it's kind of important. When you were referencing making somebody uncomfortable, I think that's also, when we were talking before about resilience and resist, I know when people ask me about this book, they go, what's the book about? And I've gotten used to it because it's not really cocktail conversation. And, I watch the face, and I also have. It took me a long time to get used to that moment where people would be like just shocked or, oh, I'm so sorry. And it was like, it's okay. It's not okay, but it's okay. And I think that's really difficult when you're doing this kind of work, or this giving people, but this is how you turn it around, giving that person, because everyone has a universal story of grief. Everyone has everyone survives something. And everyone, had a moment in their childhood where they were hurt. Yeah. And yes, there's a scale, but we can't judge how our hurt is worse than someone else's. I think it's giving people the space. That's a great story. That's a beautiful story. And I lost my dog recently, and or it was a year ago actually, but it feels recent, and I know that feeling because I don't have children, although I have nieces and nephews that are maybe closer to children than the dog was. But the dog was like, I was just floored and it brought up, I think what I've learned too is one grief can bring up all these other griefs, like unresolved grief from the past, because I started really crying a lot about my mother at that time too. And I think that it's always with you, right? I mean, when you've lost somebody, it's always with you. It comes up, and even the grief for childhood.
Yes, the grief for the childhood that you should have had and didn't have the opportunity for.
And the son that you lost, that that's not with you. It's hard, even in the happiest of occasions.
Oh, it is. And with each milestone you say, oh, if he was here, and I think that, us having conversations like this, if one person hears, our conversation today and they take it as an opening for them to start a conversation with another person and talk about the hard stuff. Yeah, that's the point of the podcast.
And I think that was in some ways the point of my book and why I go on these podcasts, really. It's from the time, because, I think it's opening the dialogue so that people who have a similar suffering or feeling can have that moment of knowing they're not alone.
That's so beautiful. What would you say to our listeners? They've listened to our conversation and something's bubbling up. What advice would you give that listener?
Well, so for survivors of sexual assault, incest, childhood, or adults, I need to always tell them the first things that you have to repeat to yourself is, it was not my fault. It was not your fault. So it's the starting place is surrendering the self-blame. Then, I do tell, and I think this is something for any of the topics we've talked about, is healing is possible. It may not be linear, but it's possible. Trust me, if I could heal from some of the things I've been through, then anyone can heal. Healing is possible. I know in many ways I've been very gifted because I was able to access good therapy, but it is possible. It's for everyone, and seek out, call hotlines. There's for sexual assault. RAINN has a 24-hour, in the national hotline in the U.S. seven days a week. They can direct you to local places. If you happen to be in LA, then I can't recommend. The UCLA Rape Treatment Center has a 24-hour hotline, and I can't recommend their services enough. They offer, for children who have been abused, they offer up to 1 year of therapy for free for the child, as well as for a non-perpetrating parent or caregiver. So it's pretty amazing. And even for older people who have been sexually assaulted, and it doesn't have to be recent, they also offer, in most cases, up to 6 months therapy. So it gives you an opportunity. I think there are organizations that do that. If you're not comfortable with that concept, tell them, some people have pastors, they have support groups, but I would say start with that. You need to tell somebody. You can't keep this secret. And for those of us that are going through like grief, for dealing with any trauma, I think you're not alone. Find people. There are grief support groups. As you probably, I'll steal your thunder. And but you're not alone. But understand that healing is cyclical, and it goes around and around and around, and all of these things will come up in pockets. Sometimes the Christmas tree lights are working perfectly. They're all lit up and everything's fine, and every once in a while a bulb goes out. I love this. It's giving this analogy forever. You no longer own it. You have given it to you.
With pleasure.
But sometimes the light goes out or starts to blink, and then it's good to be able to acknowledge it, address it, give it grace, and if you need more help is the best 4-letter word. Fine, not so good. So those are the things I would tell people.
That is some really great advice. Can you tell our listeners before we finish up how they can find your book and find you online on social media and stuff like that?
Great. So my book is called Such a Pretty Picture, and it is available anywhere books are sold, independent bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. I like to let listeners know this because it's nice when you buy a book to know sometimes that things are actually being given to help the actual cause. I am giving my royalties. I'm very, very lucky. I am grateful every day to be here and to be able to have written a book and to be in the position that I'm in life. And I am giving my royalties, not the publishers, but my part, to the Rape and Incest National Network. It's 25%, and the rest goes to local rape treatment centers. A lot here in LA, of course, because I'm here, but I pick other organizations throughout the country. I've spoken at 10 different places. So whenever I'm at a bookstore, I look up and I'm looking up other organizations, and I try to donate to them. And that from that pool, it's not a big pool because writers don't make a fortune, but I'm so committed to this mission and to making people aware of this. So it's anywhere books are sold. I'll go off on my tangent again and forget about telling about myself. Anywhere books are sold. It's such a pretty picture. And I'm on Instagram right now. I'm thinking about TikTok. Haven't quite done it yet, but might be. I have a younger friend who's going to help me with that. But my Instagram is Andrea Leeb, and my website is AndreaLeebAuthor.com. And I have, for sexual assault survivors, I have a little content for places where you can find it, hotlines and places where you can call people.
Oh my goodness, that's excellent. So we'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes as well.
I would appreciate it, because I go off on a tangent and start telling people, you have to tell people. It's so funny how something goes from an idea to a mission.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know about you, but I certainly didn't expect to be doing this today. Like if someone said, you're going to have a podcast and you're going to do this and you're going to talk about grief, I would have said, yeah.
Well, even in writing a book, I thought, I'd write a book and we could publish and that would be it. And I was a really private person. I had 0 Instagram followers, and I was barely on Facebook. I mean, the only one I have is LinkedIn. And so getting out here and doing it now with TV, it's like crazy. And I never would have expected any of that. I didn't understand, but I've been pushing it to the max so much because of the mission. The book became the foundation for a greater platform. So
turning your pain into purpose. Yeah. I mean, it's such important work that you are doing. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about so many complex topics with me. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do to help others.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. I know we've covered a lot of topics, but I just like to talk it's so fun to talk with folks like you. So I really do appreciate it.
Oh, I enjoyed every single minute. Thank you so much.